Welcome to GladAlliance.org. I'm Phil Shepard, better known as the Whiskey Preacher, and I'm one of the co-founding pastors of the Eucatastrophe, which is a Christian church disciples of Christ, open and affirming faith community located in Fort Worth, Texas. And I've created this short vidcast in the hopes of giving encouragement for those of us who did not grow up in an open and affirming faith tradition. I did not start out as somebody who embraced diversity very well. Like many evangelicals, or post-evangelicals as I call myself, we grew up thinking that homosexuality was the abominational sin. And I didn't always believe how I believe now. And I want to tell you that if you come from that same type of faith tradition, you do not have to be stuck there. I remember specifically when I was in high school, my senior year, there was I won't say large homosexual community in my high school, but they were large enough that people noticed. And being the evangelical that I was, I thought it was my duty to save these people from the pits of hell. And I wasn't very loving about it. I wasn't very... I was almost Kirk Cameron about it sometimes, and that's not a good thing. I remember my friend Christy, she came up to me one day and she said, "You know, Phil, you are one of the nicest people that I know and one of the most loving people I know, except when it comes to homosexuals." And she was specifically were talking about our friend Cameron, who I knew that he also had, quote-unquote, the label of Christian, but he struggled with his sexuality. And I wasn't very nice to him about that. And to this day, I feel horrible about that. And one day, if I ever get the chance to ever apologize to Cameron, I will. But that really made me start thinking about how I treated people. And it really helped out that my youth pastor at the time, Tracy, who I still consider a very close friend, one of my oldest friends in the world, and a mentor in the ministry, he really challenged me on how I interacted with people, especially when it came with stuff that what then I would call struggling with their sin. And so I really tried and went out of my way to stop just loving the sinner and hating the sin. I shifted from that to just trying to love people. And it wasn't until many years later when I ended up in seminary, I went to Baylor University, Truett Seminary, that I realized that even that frame of thinking was not healthy or even fair. I remember being in class one day, and I don't remember if it was my second year or third year of seminary, but we got on the topic in my scriptures class about historical context in Scripture. And the topic of homosexuality came up. And I remember my professor saying that homosexuality in the New Testament, contextually and culturally, has nothing to do with homosexuality that we're dealing with in the present. And many of us asked, well, what did that mean? And he went on to tell us that the text that Paul had written had to do more with the aristocracy who became a part of the Christian movement in the early days of Christianity were taking advantage of their men and boy servants, and that was so counter to the message of Jesus, which was loving the Lord your God with all your heart, strength, and soul and spirit, and loving your neighbor as yourself. And hanging all the law of the prophets on that commandment. And I remember thinking to myself that if the Old Testament, when the scriptures in the Levitical law that mention homosexuality really had nothing to do with homosexuality here in the present either, it had to do with the Jewish people, specifically males, wasting their seed. And the New Testament scriptures that were dealing with homosexuality had specifically to do with raping and pedophilia. Then I didn't see what the problem was. I remember thinking to myself, and I actually raised my hand, and I said, you're trying to tell me that none of this has to do with what we're dealing with today, and you still think it's wrong? And his response was, yes, I do, but yes, you're right. It has nothing contextually to do with homosexuality now. From that day on, I no longer thought homosexuality was a sin. A correction, I no longer believed homosexuality was a sin. And it was not an overnight decision for me. It was a evolving part of my journey. And those of you who've come from or are coming from a faith tradition like myself who don't embrace an open and affirming community, I really want to encourage you to have conversations, get to know somebody who's actually a homosexual, a gay, lesbian, transgender, questioning person, and be in community with them. I challenge you to do that. It was life-changing for me, and it continues to be life-changing for me. So when we started the Eucatastrophe, knowing now where a little bit of my story of where I evolved from to where I am today, we decided that there were going to be a handful of non-negotiables. We were going into a place where evangelical Christian subculture had saturated the rest of the culture surrounding us. And with that, there are some social norms that are, for a lot of people, non-negotiable for themselves, for their church communities. Women in ministry, women cannot be pastors. And anybody from the LGBTQ community, really, unless they decided to put their homosexuality or their questioning to the side, really cannot be a part of a faith community. And we said that that's not going to be who we are. That we were not going to do that. It was just not going to even be debatable. My wife, Stephanie, who helped co-found the Eucatastrophe, is my co-pastor. She's called to vocational ministry as a pastor. And so it was just not going to be an issue. We're just not even going to talk about it. To be able to try to create a faith community that's trying to take the next step in the Christian story, it was just not a topic we even wanted to argue about. And being open and affirming. We wanted to be open and affirming to everybody. Not only to the LGBTQ community, but anybody who was questioning, anybody who didn't know what they believe and still don't know what they believe. And one of the other things that we decided is that we don't have to agree on everything to still be community. That the table that we have is not our table, but it's Jesus' table, and that anybody is welcome. I hope this short vidcast has been able to give you some hope if you come from a tradition, like I said, like I have come from, that was not open and affirming, or that is not open and affirming. God's grace and forgiveness and your willingness to be moldable can bring you to a spot where God can transform you. And God can help you provide a place that everyone is welcome. Thank you so much for coming by gladalliance.org. Thanks for taking time to watching this vidcast. If you want to have this conversation on Twitter, use the hashtag GladAlliance. Or you can use my hashtag, which is Whiskey Preacher. You can find me on Facebook, which is Whiskey Preacher as well. You can like my fan page. Or you can find me at my website, which is whiskeypreacher.com. Remember, and I'll close with this, that God has called us, no matter where we stand, to love the Creator and to love the creation and embrace beauty. And that's what gladalliance.org is trying to do. bring a little more beauty into the world, bring a little more tolerance into the world, create an equal ground for everybody to be able to experience the open table of Jesus Christ. Thanks again for joining us, and have a good day.